is Nurul Ali Atira binti Kamaruzaman and I from Group 9. Today, my friend and I will be presenting our sensory project. Our title is Directional Pack Comparison Test on Rose Syrup Sweetness. This presentation, we will cover the background of the study, the objective, methodology, result and conclusion. Let us begin with the introduction. For the introduction, the background of our study is rose syrup formulations can vary due to differences in sugar concentration and processing conditions, which can affect sweetness and aroma. Currently, the industry focuses on healthier formulation and better quality control, often by adjusting sugar levels. Research shows that even small changes in sweetener concentration can influence physical properties, chemical properties, and sensory attributes. Therefore, sensory evaluation is important to determine whether these differences can be detected. In this study, a directional pack comparison test is used to evaluate sweetness differences between rose syrup sample. For this slide, it explains the background of rose syrup. Rose syrup has been traditionally used in beverage across South and Southeast Asia and is known for its strong floral aroma, bright red color, and sweet taste. In Malaysia, it is commonly used in traditional drinks such as rose syrup drink and bandung syrup. The main ingredients include sugar, water, rose flavor, and fermented food colorings. Although the ingredients are simple, small changes in sugar concentration can affect the sweetness perception that make rose syrup suitable for the sensory study. This slide presents the objective of the study. The objective is to determine whether panelists can detect a difference in sweetness between two rose syrup samples with slightly different sugar concentration using the directional pack comparison test. And this slide shows the hypothesis of the study. The first one is null hypothesis. Null hypothesis, there is no significant difference in the perceived sweetness intensity between the two rose syrup samples with different level of concentration. And the second one is alternative hypothesis, which is there is a significant difference in the perceived sweetness intensity between the two rose syrup samples, with one sample being perceived as sweeter than the other.
For this sensory test, we involved 60 untrained panelists. All of them were aged between 18 to 26 years old, so they represent young adult consumer. We chose untrained panelists because our aim was to reflect general consumer perception and not expert judgment. Before the test started, all panelists were briefed on the purpose of the study and the testing procedure. Their response were kept anonymous to avoid any bias. For the sample, we prepared two rose syrup drinks using amine rose syrup. Both samples had the same amount of rose syrup to keep the flavor consistent. The only difference between them was the sugar concentration, where sample A contained 8% sugar, while sample B contained 10% sugar, which is the standard formulation. This allowed us to evaluate whether panelists could detect a difference in sweetness. For test and procedure, we conduct a directional pack comparison test. Two samples were prepared, sample A with 8% sugar and sample B with 10% sugar, using the same brand, water source, and preparation method. The samples were labeled with random 3-digit codes and served in identical cups. Each panelist received both samples at the same time, but the serving order was randomized. They rinsed their mouths with water before and between the tasting to prevent carryover effects. Panelists were then asked to indicate which sample was sweeter. All responses were collected and recorded for further statistical analysis. Based on the consumer survey, most of the panelists were aged 18 to 20 years, making up 56% of the participants. This was followed by 21 to 23 years age group at 27%, and 17% were aged between 24 to 26 years. In terms of gender, 58% of the panelists were female, while 42% were male. Overall, this shows a fairly balanced representation of young consumers. Most of the panelists, about 78%, reported that they often drink rose syrup, while 22% do not. When we look at how often they consume it, monthly consumption was the most common at 48%. This was followed by weekly consumption at 20%, while 10% consume it rarely. Only 5% consume rose syrup daily, and none of the panelists said they never consume it. This shows that most panelists were already familiar with rose syrup drink. In terms of consumption time, most panelists drink rose syrup during lunchtime, which accounts for 67%. This is followed by dinner at 28%, while breakfast had the lowest percentage at 5%. When asked about preference, half of the panelists preferred the sweeter version, some preferred a less sweet version, while a smaller number preferred rose syrup with gas or had no specific preference. When asked about the main reason for choosing rose syrup drink, this was the most important factor for the panelists. Other reasons include affordable price, quality, availability, and brand. This clearly shows that taste and sweetness play a major role in consumer choice. From the result of the test, 92% of the panelists, which is 55 people, correctly identified the sweeter sample. Only 8% or 5 panelists gave incorrect answers. This indicates that the majority of the panelists were able to detect a difference in sweetness between the two samples. Overall, the results show the panelists were clearly able to detect the sweetness difference between the two samples. Sample B, which contained 10% sugar, was consistently perceived as sweeter than sample A. This suggests that even a small difference in sugar concentration can be noticeable to consumers.
For the directional pack comparison test, 60 panelists evaluated which sample is sweeter. Under the null hypothesis, panelists are assumed to guess, so the probability of choosing either sample is 0.5. According to the Rosler table at 5% significance level, the minimum number of correct responses required for significance is 37. In this study, 55 panelists identified sample B as sweeter, which exceeds the critical value. Therefore, the null hypothesis is rejected and sample B is perceived as significantly sweeter. Next, the chi-square test was used to determine whether the observed sweetness differ from the expected 50-50 distribution. Under the null hypothesis, 30 panelists were expected to choose each sample. However, 55 panelists selected sample B, while only 5 selected sample A. The adjusted chi-square value calculated was 40.02, which is greater than the critical value of 3.84 at 1 degree of freedom. This indicates that the observed preference is statistically significant and not due to chance. A z-test for proportion was conducted to compare the observed proportion of panelists choosing sample B with the chance level of 0.5. The calculated z-value was 6.47, which exceeds the critical z-value of 1.645 for a one-day test at 5% significance level. This confirms that sample B was chosen as sweeter significantly more often than expected by random guessing. Overall, all three statistical analyses, namely the Rosler test, chi-square test, and z-test, consistently indicate a significant difference in sweetness perception. The results confirm that the rose syrup with 10% sugar concentration is perceived as significantly sweeter than the 8% sugar sample. Therefore, the alternative hypothesis is accepted.
Now I will explain about discussions. Firstly, in this sensory evaluation test, we aim to determine whether a small difference in sugar concentration, specifically 8% and 10% in rose syrup drinks, could be detected in terms of sweetness. A directional paired comparison test was conducted using 60 panelists. The results show a clear and consistent pattern where sample B was perceived as sweeter than sample A. Okay, now let's move on to Rosler table decisions. Based on the Rosler table analysis, 55 panelists correctly identified sample B as sweeter. This number exceeded the critical value of 37, which required at the 5% significant level. Therefore, the difference in sweetness perception was statistically significant, and the null hypothesis stating that there was no difference between the sample was rejected. For adjusted chi-square test, the adjusted chi-square test further supported this finding. The calculated chi-square value was 40.02, which is much higher than the critical value of 3.84. This indicates that the observed response were not due to chance and that panelists were able to consistently detect a sweetness difference between the two samples. For the Z-test analysis, the Z-test analysis show a Z value of 6.47, exceeding the critical Z value of 1.645 at the 95% confidence level. This confirms that sample B was perceived as significantly sweeter than sample A. The agreement among all three statistical tests strengthens the reliability of the study results. For the consumer survey insight, the consumer survey provided for the explanation for this result. Most panelists expressed a preference for sweeter rose syrup drinks, and taste was identified as the main factor influencing their choice. Since many panelists were regular syrup consumers, their familiarity with the product likely enhanced their sensitivity to sweetness difference. Now we have reached the conclusions. In this test, we have concluded that the study have demonstrated a significant difference in perceived sweetness between the two rose syrup samples, which is sample B with a 10% sugar concentration was consistently perceived as sweeter than sample A, leading to the rejection of the null hypothesis. These results show that even small change in sugar concentration are noticeable to consumers and can influence product acceptance. Therefore, sensory evaluation plays a crucial role in product formulation, quality control, and sugar reduction strategies, especially in beverage product. That's all from us. Assalamualaikum.